kind of a temporary thing, and also never forgetting that these champions, the ones that are used, are expendable. That's why. None of them have any shelf life. And the first moment that something goes awry, they'll be deleted from concern or compromised so that people think, oh, they're kooks. And then some other person comes, like Paul Simon said, another hero up the pop charts. You know. But again, the ad copy alone is telling you something about the split schizoid nature of what's going on. This is coming in more and more even in the videos that are used. We'll finish off by pulling back from the canvas again to remind ourselves how this all comes into being. Why is this cult using this power? I mean, we can't sit here and go into a huge story about, you know, the cognitive mind and the subconscious mind and whether or not even subliminal persuasion, you know, works or not. I have to keep it strictly about the fact that I don't want you to assume it, but I want you to research it, but to take on board the power that this kind of persuasion has. But also that power works two ways. They're using it on us, but we can return it. We can take the power back, because the moment that you are aware of what these people are doing, they only have a certain limited weaponry, by the way. It's very powerful, as you can see. And it is also ubiquitous. But the thing is that once you become aware of it, just your simple awareness, they've lost their power. That's it. It doesn't work on the person who knows what it is. Not in a contemptuous way, well, I think it's rubbish, so I don't listen to it. No, your mind is wide open. You have to have an empowered understanding of what they're doing and why they're doing it and how they're doing it. Know thine enemy, says the Bible, right? Very true. And know the weapons that the enemy is also using. But the moment that you do, you gain the psychic immunity that stops their power. That's it. It's psychological warfare. You can't raise up arms against these people. They're ready for you. It's too crazy. They know how that game works. But this is the way that you understand it. Once you've cracked the secret, you see, then you have the sword that cuts the Gordian knot of all the other complications. The point was made about symbolism by the Scottish historian Thomas Carlyle, who said that by symbols is man guided and commanded, made happy, made wretched. He everywhere finds himself surrounded with symbols, recognized as such or not recognized. And that is the loophole that this particular cult of sorcerers have used. I mean, it sounds bizarre, but there you have it. Who are these people? Well, they are ideologically, I would even go so far as to say biologically, but certainly ideologically connected, by the way, to ancient sorcerers of the ancient world, particularly a group known as the Medes, or at least the people who have plagiarized the knowledge of the Medes in the same way that the knowledge of the Druids and the Omanists was also plagiarized. But there's actually, the word Media comes from a group of people known as the Media, or the Medes, a very, very ancient group that was ensconced up in a place called Medea. Words like Medic and Medici comes from these terms. It's a place not far from Parthia or Persia. And these were the astrologers, the wise ones, the geomancers, the healers, the apothecaries that the kings of the world called on when you wanted to deal with your enemies, when you wanted to put the spell on them. The word Medea is found in mythology as a female. She was actually related physically to Circe in mythology, and she herself was a murderess and a hypnotist that hypnotized people with drugs. Go and study Medea, M-E-D-E-A, the goddess who hypnotized people using drugs to put them into complete delirium. She's actually related to Circe, another goddess known to turn men into pigs. Right? And now there was actually 6 tribes within, I have an article, this one, that you can look at, History of the Medes. It's just a compilation of information that I found on the Medes. There were 6 tribes of the Medes, and the most powerful of the tribes was called Magi. That's where the word comes from magician. Is actually the name of a tribe within the Median peoples, where the word magus comes from. And the word actually meant rich, powerful, high, intelligent, and it really represented men who are like the highest ones, the high men of the world, the ones overlooking, the ones who've got the great knowledge, the great teachers. And if you read this little article I put up there, I go into those 6 and give the names. They're Aryan. There's a lot of Arya tie in there. Another fascinating subject. The Medes. Their knowledge is what is behind the Holy Wood, right, which is very similar to Holy Rood, a place in Scotland run by the Templars. I believe it's not that these Medes are still alive, but these great groups, whether they're Mithraic, Amonist, Druidic, Chaldean, whoever, Chaldean, their knowledge is what is being misused now. You see what I'm saying? Masonry, these organizations are corrupt because they're using sacred knowledge that was for the uplift of all people for a specific elite, for a specific purpose. The knowledge doesn't belong to them, but they're misusing it. This kind of knowledge knows things that we're not supposed to know. They took this route to use subversive symbolism to manipulate us because they understand the workings of the brain. They understand that there's 37 sensory inputs to the brain, not 5. Well, what's happening with those other senses? Well, didn't we hear R.D. Laing last time? Any so-called abnormal function or behavior or experience is now going to be considered a mark of insanity or dementia. Everything's going to be homogenized. So is our consensus reality. Don't anthropologists know that a habitat of an animal right outside its purview, that animals can be trained, their habitat can be changed on the periphery of their vision, that they haven't the faintest idea what's going on? But slowly the behavior of that animal will be changed because its habitat has been changed. Not all training, you see, is direct. Not all puppets are on strings. And they understand the esoteric, and that's what you find. The use of the wand, the use of the lantern, the use of the sword, the use of these remarkable symbols that you find all throughout the royal families and their connection to the human being is a remarkable study. The whole of Egypt, as the great Swallow de Lubitsch pointed out, was designed to emulate and to simulate the subtle energy of the body, which again it ties into music and all sorts of other phenomena. Then we have the same gang as they start to misuse this symbolism. Oh, we can't have it for everybody. Wow, this really has a lot of power. Shit, what are we going to do? So then you have the prohibition in the Bible against graven images that comes before the prohibition against murder. Right? The prohibition against graven images is before Exodus 20, thou shalt not make for yourself a graven image. And Leonard Slane points this out in his book, The Alphabet versus the Goddess. The second commandment forbids Israelites from conveying any iconic information. No illustrations, no colorful drawings, and no art. So far as we know, there has never before existed a culture that forbade representative art. Why should a prohibition against making images be the second most important rule for righteous living? According to the Ten Commandments, art, therefore, is more dangerous than murder. I hope we've been pointing out why. It's because they wanted the arsenal for themselves. Take it out of the hands of humanity. Take it out of the shaman. Take it out of the true keepers of truth. And hoard it for yourself because you've got an agenda. Jerry Mander says the same thing. The Hebrews, emerging between 3000 and 2000 BC, won an important political victory by denouncing what they called the worship of graven images. By destroying the power of the sculptures of the Sumerians and others who preceded them, they effectively destroyed nature-based religion and the veracity of images. Biologically, it means, and psychologically, they close off a whole part of your brain. They want to put a wall between the left and the right brain is basically what happened, between the masculine and the feminine capacities. That's how you control, isn't it? Divide and conquer, right? In this sign you will conquer. This made possible, he says, the substitution of an abstract, single, male, human, all-powerful God, because it was a sin to create any sculpture of it. It maintained its abstract nature. And so much can be said of this. It's like cutting off your hands. They're cutting off one part of your brain because they're going to control what's left by using this powerful symbolism that is archival. It's absolutely in your race memory, going back to the connection that you have directly with nature, to the stars. Everything in religion, I don't give a damn if it's Protestant or Catholic, comes from astrotheology, the history and the study of the stars. And that is in the deepest reservoir of your unconscious. And while you're tapped into that gnosis, you can't be controlled. So they have to put those barriers up. They have to put those electrical fences up so that they block and canalize that imagination body. It's going to be very important because when we look at solutions in a minute, this is This is the way forward, once you've understood it. But first of all, if poison has been pouring into your home, you can't start the cleaning up process until you shut the door on the sewer, isn't it? So this is what we're doing. You're going to do the cleanup through your life. But you first have to make sure that the poison doesn't keep pouring in. So the immunity that you get from understanding what these characters are up to immediately shuts down the process. You're completely onto it critically. That closes the door, and then the cleanup is even easier. There really are no other remedies. The great philosopher from Germany, Leibniz, it is a great source of error to believe that there is no perception in the soul besides those of which it is conscious. Before Freud, talking 1700s here, 18th century, already understood. Pascal even had spoken of the same things. Schopenhauer, about how the brain is just besieged with all of the stimuli. The opponents, as we said, they know what we're never supposed to know. Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi minister of propaganda, he said, this is the secret of propaganda. Those who are to be persuaded by it should be completely immersed in the ideas of the propaganda without ever noticing that they are immersed in it. Remember the comments of Edward Bernays, the modern mind controllers and persuaders? I'll leave you with this for this section by Alvin Boyd Kuhn. This incredible statement by Alvin Boyd Kuhn. Alvin Boyd Kuhn, by the way, was the prodigy of Gerald Massey, the great Scottish Egyptologist. And Alvin Boyd Kuhn says, hypnotism need not be induced by overt manipulation or by an operative. One can hypnotize oneself, and the agency can be a suggestion, a philosophy, a persuasion, a conviction, a belief, an infatuation, a book, a sermon, a piece of music, a personality, an addiction of any kind. Hold a conviction long enough, and it ends by holding you. Now we know it as obsession and what have you. If you really take this to the full extent of what he's saying, thinking itself is a primal addiction. We spoke before about Heidegger not even using the word consciousness to describe the thought of most people. And the idea is that over time, and I believe that's what we're seeing right now, is that because of this pestilence, and this is one of the things in the armory of the sorcerers, they knew that by purveying this for years and years and years, this slow drip feed method, that in the end, man would auto-hypnotize himself. Demons may lead you to the brink of the precipice, but they actually can't make you jump. You do that yourself out of fear. Then they have the last laugh. If you're out of your power, you're the victim of anything. A small breeze can topple an oak tree, if that oak tree is not properly, rooted. Because in the in the personality of human beings, it's a simple axiomatic fact of psychology that your psyche, in order to grow high, right, like a great tree, you must at the same time be sinking your roots deeply into the earth. And that means into yourself, into your own soil, into the soil of truth and reality. Otherwise you may grow very high and then it's, what? Catastrophe. And when you fall, you don't just destroy yourself, you take half the forest with you. Anyway, what we'll do now is move to solutions to conclude with. So that we can get even a greater handle on this. So that, looking at the problem is balanced also by resolving it. We'll cover I'll introduce you to a couple of interesting sources and books in a minute. Again, people can always stay tuned to the 2012 webcast we did, The Future of Mankind, which connects with what we're going to be talking about right now. My Outsider series, 3 interviews, also pertains to this. And those are all on my new account, Unslaved Films, on YouTube. Again, I emphasize that's the only legitimate account. Unslaved Media and Unslaved Films and Unslaved.com. One of the important books I'd like to bring to your attention and the work of a man is Theodore Roszak, The Voice of the Earth. He also wrote a fantastic book called Where the Wasteland Ends. 2 very important books, C.J. Jung, Carl Jung's works on nature. A book called The Earth Has a Soul, and a monumentally important book by the great psychologist Bruno Bettelheim, personal friend of Sigmund Freud, about the mistranslation of Freud's work and books, right down to the titles. So when people talk about knowing Freudianism, there's a whole conspiracy against Freud run by the American Psychiatric Association to basically de-spiritualize his work. And this is a very important book that addresses this, about how even the terminology, when he talked about the conscious and unconscious minds, his words in German were loaded with spiritual meaning and really deep existential meanings, and those were purposely mistranslated to make him appear to be a materialist reductionist. A conspiracy against his work. And a very heavy-hitting psychologist. Beautifully written and very valuable book. From a more of a scientific bent, or let's say alternative bent, a book I refer to a lot of my work is Richard Milton, The Shattering the Myths of Darwin. Again, a heavy hitter. He was the scientific correspondent for the Observer magazine, who deals with the whole evolution lie. On my Irish Origins appendix pages, there's also a little page there on the lie of evolution. Two important books again on alternative science. The Holographic Universe by Michael Talbot, which goes deeply into the work of David Bohm and Carl Pribram on the connections between the mind and nature, consciousness and the world. Subatomic science, quantum science, what is known as the implicate order, as opposed to the explicate order. A very reader-friendly book, an absolute masterpiece. For those who are even more into the science, The Big Bang Never Happened by Eric J. Lerner. That is a wonderful book that goes into the works of Hans Alfvén, the Swedish scientist, and his plasma cosmology that refutes the Einsteinian paradigm. A little more heavy reading though. Leonard Schleyn's Art and Physics and The Alphabet versus the Goddess, I think, are essential reading. More from what we'll be talking about today, the existentialist paradigms that we'll be discussing. If people are really unfamiliar with this existentialistic angle that I deal with a lot in my work, such as Disciples of the Mysterium, Colin Wilson's The Outsider is a very good introduction. And if you're more into fiction, then of course Hermann Hesse, the great author, will introduce you to that paradigm, the existentialistic paradigm. And I guess if you're into poetry, then of course we can mention many names, the top of which is Rainer Maria Rilke. Alan Watts's The Book, we'll be referring to that a lot in this presentation. The full title is The Book on the Taboo Against Knowing Who You Are. And the very important book that I refer to a lot, Erich Fromm's The Anatomy of Human Destructiveness. Again, phenomenally important works of Arno Gruen, The Betrayal of the Self, The Insanity of Normality. Very much akin to R.D. Laing, because these are, along with Thomas Szasz, these are the people who are the anti-psychiatric. It's very important to read these kinds of works, because once you know who the greats are, well then you can easily spot the faux version. There's so many voices in the world. Read the masters. When you've digested the meaning and the depth of what they say, hey, the job of finding out who's the Judas or just half-baked truth becomes very obvious. Read the masters, because then you save the world from your ignorance. You know, there's a statement, isn't there? The man who does not like to read is the equal of one who cannot read. And then, as we showed in the trailer, highly recommended works of the psychologist Thomas Szasz, The Myth of Mental Illness. I emphasize these people because I believe it's monumentally important when it comes to solutions. And what I'm going to say now, you should listen to like you've never listened to anything else in your life. Because it's very, very important for the people you know, for yourself, and for the people that you're going to meet every day, especially in the coming years. Because everybody's talking about breakdown, everybody's talking about losing the thread, everybody's talking about their depressions. What happens if those depressions, if those feelings of futility, anxiety, whatever, are the closest you or that person have ever been to true selfhood? But that part of the mind, conditioned by all this pestilence that we've been talking about, is making you think that it's not. What happens if your depression is your best friend and your greatest teacher? And we went into this in the 2012 talk in Los Angeles. Mentioned it in brief. What happens if your tragedy, your pain, your anxiety, your angst is the closest you have ever come, or that person who's giving you those problems, that laundry list of how they can't handle it, can't keep the job, can't keep the marriage, as if that's all normal? They can't find the harmony and the normality in an abnormal, deeply sick world? Do you know that the door to reality, the gate, is incredibly narrow? I don't want to become biblical with you here. I don't want to preach a sermon, but the way out of this maze is extremely narrow. It's very hard. We're talking very serious stuff here. And we have to turn around, right, and re-examine a lot of what we've been told, even by a lot of the psychologists and the doctors and the so-called experts. What happens if those dark voices that you think are so alien and so foreign and so ghastly are actually there because this is the first time in your life that you've actually even approached the shrine of your own selfhood, your own aloneness, your own stillness. But the chorus of all that other stuff and all the chorus of the experts has you completely thinking the opposite. And so it's big pharma now, and it's drugs, and it's futility, and it's even suicide. Or it's immersion in all the other falseness of the world, thinking that you're now returned to sanity. Now Heidegger already said this about our consciousness, the inauthentic and the authentic man. Because the pain and the so-called tragedy that comes with authenticity has its own beauty. It's in the running away from all of these aspects of yourself that's when the problems arise. In talks of people like myself, we're forever pointing out that there's an external adversary. We just spent 2 hours doing it. But the negotiation of that external adversary and all of its elements and all of its arsenal is really only 50% of the extraction process. It's a very valuable aspect. But as a matter of fact, there are 2 demons that stand between you and the road of selfhood or the road of truth. 2 demons, and one is the internal adversary. So those who leave that aspect out, leave out the psychology, are only helping you somewhat, because you have the external adversary to fend off and become aware of and study and disempower, but you also have this thing inside yourself, the mind, the ego, the conditioning. You see, all the vices that they've put there. The anti-psychologists are basically telling you, look, you think that if you live in this world, being a self is almost considered a disease. Well, as a matter of fact, it is. The search for your own selfhood has become the ultimate disease. So everything else that leads you away from selfhood has been endorsed by the world. And so now the world is screaming for down with Big Brother, and Illuminati must be destroyed. Because we understand that the people who are working behind the world, who control the world, are sick. They're demented, they're psychopathic. And in fact, as I've said before, they are the beings that are holding civilization back. But just as on a social level, right, these destroyers, these sorcerers, they hold society, they hold culture, they hold civilization back. How can you fight them when their poison is in your head and your thought processes is holding you back? You see how it works on the microcosmic and the macrocosmic level? If your thinking has identified with the master, then your own development and progress is stunted and arrested. Isn't it almost a paradox to believe that you can run out then in the social world and bring down this other higher pestilence? It's a reciprocal relationship between your own mind and your own thought patterns and your own strength or lack of it and what is going on in the social domain. But before we can get deeply into the solutions, we've got to start at the beginning. You begin at the beginning again. Trauma, ancient trauma. Everything you see today, everything that's made by mind, everything that's made by thought is a manifestation of ancient trauma, which we've gone into at great length in other works. Paul Shepard, an activist and commentator on this problem, in his book A Kind of Madness, says the change to a more hostile stance towards nature began between 5,000 and 10,000 years ago, and became more destructive and less accountable with the progress of civilization. In hindsight, this change has been explained in terms of necessity or as the decline of ancient gods. but more likely it was an irrational, though not unlogical, and unconscious, a kind of failure in some fundamental dimension of human existence. An irrationality beyond mistakenness, a kind of madness. So here we are, we're conscious. We talked last time about the weight of that and the bittersweetness of it, the fact that man has consciousness that maybe other forms of life don't have. Theodosius Dobzhansky, the geneticist, says that self-awareness and foresight brought the awesome gifts of freedom and responsibility. Man feels free to execute some of his plans and to leave others in abeyance. He feels the joy of being the master of the world and of himself. But the joy is tempered by the feeling of responsibility. Man knows that he is accountable for his acts. He has acquired the knowledge of good and evil. This is a dreadfully heavy load to carry. No other animal has to withstand anything like it. There is a tragic discord in the soul of man. So in various ways, these experts have noticed this conflict, this diremption in the human psyche. Partly to do with this fact that we can think about meaning, we can think about life, we can think about thought. And we can also hold our actions, we can feel responsible for our actions, which brings out guilt and shame and accountability and all sorts of things. We can also think about the future. We have temporal consciousness. We saw these quotes before by Jung. He said that consciousness is a very recent acquisition of nature and that is still in an experimental state. It is frail, menaced by specific dangers, and easily injured. As anthropologists have noted, one of the most common mental derangements that occur among primitive people is what they call the loss of a soul. And he goes on to say that I'm not denying that great gains have resulted from the evolution of civilized society, but these gains have been made at the price of enormous losses, whose extent we have scarcely begun to estimate. Now I would stop there, you see, and the rest of this presentation is basically a question of losses? What losses? Let's get into that. What do you mean when you say that the gains of what we have something over here that's really good, but you say that it's been gained at the price of enormous losses? I'd like to know what those are. Maybe that's the answer. Maybe the investigation of that will lead us to the heart of the problem. The kind of consciousness we have, as I said, that type of interiority, right, that subjectivity that came with the trauma, because as Julian Jaynes and others have shown, you didn't have a consciousness of yourself. You didn't have a feeling of what you might call selfhood. You didn't have that feeling, I am a separate identity, all through the centuries. That is a recent concept. And of course, the animals of the world, they don't have quite that same type of consciousness. But at the same time, they are directly piped into what is real. Nature and their minds are plugged in, because they're not sitting there worrying about their death and worrying about their actions and all the other stuff that we humans are involved with. Right? Scientists have tried to reduce it and go, well, they just have instinct, without even really telling you what that is or where it comes from. No, instinct is the fact that they are governed by the ordinances of nature, which they also obey. We have lost touch of that. We don't obey it, they do. The great teacher Alan Watts said that nothing so eludes conscious inspection as consciousness itself. This is why the root of consciousness has been called, paradoxically, the unconscious. Now that's very interesting. It pertains to the divisions that exist within consciousness. We don't even, in our definition of consciousness, we have to admit that it's divided or subdivided. Right brain, left brain, right? Mammalian, limbic, frontal, etc. Or conscious, unconscious. That's very interesting. Is that part of the trauma? Because we saw with the mind control concepts, yes it is. Splitting the mind also involves multiple personalities, dividing in order to be able to control. So have we done that? Are we victims in that same sense? Where the house is like a mansion with men. And also, by having that kind of split and that kind of division, those ego defenses that all psychologists know about, what does that do to thought? What does that do? Or if we are divided within, right, where you actually now are feeling that one part of you, you're disassociated from it, it's not part of you, it's not integrated into consciousness, then we have to find the internal adversary. And we know that it is. And it doesn't matter whether you buy into Freud's 3-part schemata, or Jung's 4-part schemata. It's simple. We know that there's a conscious and unconscious self. Many divisions. We have the persona. We even call people, persons. Right? Here's a person. The word just means a facade. You know? Even the very word refers to just a facade. And as I said, if you have disharmony within these modes of being, right, within the anatomy of your own psyche, some people have more, some people have less. If you have these kinds of divisions and this kind of disharmony, you're not only a weaker individual, you are now dependent on all the gimmickry that's going to come in and tell you how to gain it. So instantly you've lost your center. And then one thing leads to yet another and another and another, as you try to get out of the mix, out of the problem. As we said, the door to truth is narrower than you think. We are entrapped in a maze, in a web. And the strange thing about that web is that the more that you try to escape from it, the tighter it becomes. We're strangling ourselves often by our very attempts to be free. Who do you think loves that? Who do you think earns dividends because of our efforts, even spiritually, to liberate ourselves? Who earns points from that? Who is established from that? Do you see what I'm trying to say? That the bottom of the pyramid supports the top in the internal conflicts and the inability to resolve it in true ways, holistic ways, and by all the fakery and the gimmickry and the running into all the false things. The most evil psychopaths sunning themselves because of it. It's reciprocal. Never forget that. Then the psychologists who say, well, okay, then we'll just deal with opening those inner reservoirs for you. We'll show you the right way. What happens? The inner adversary thinks differently. Freud found that if the analyst touched upon repressed material, the patient would resist his therapeutic approach. This is not a matter of conscious unwillingness on the part of the patient or of dishonesty or of secretiveness. He is defending himself against the discovery of the unconscious material without being aware either of the material or of his resistance. The patient can turn away from the sensitive topic and talk about something else. It's like Heidegger's chit-chat. He can feel sleepy and tired. He can find a reason not to come to the interview, or he can become very angry against the analyst and find some reason to quit the analysis. Ever tried playing shadow to people? It's the resistance, if you take what I said last time. By resisting going into the unconscious, remember Jung's quote about the shadow? And I said that another translation was that by not doing the shadow work, it's really basically that you're, like he said, doing anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid dealing with your soul. That's what this is all about. That resistance is not just a reflex to stop you going into the unconscious. It's the reflex that prevents you from growing and making your own soul, if you take my theory that that's what we're here to do. It's so important that this resistance and what it's about. Because if you're thinking you came in with the soul and the soul is there, then of course this is meaningless. This is absolutely meaningless. But the moment that you realize that your life and your experience is here to develop the thing called your soul that you don't have when you come in. You have nature's spark of life, that's animate, that's different. But the soul, your individual purpose, your dharma, you don't have, and you're meant to build that here. And that's what this is really talking about. That we resist doing that. Then we have to look into that, why that would be. Now, the present era, the age of revealing, the age of awakening. Well, the trauma, I say, occurred in relatively recent times. The plagues we experience are relatively new. We are in the beginning stages of understanding and recovery. This healing has negative consequences for the architects of control and for all forms of totalitarianism, as we've already stated. We are young. This trauma happened recently, so we're still in the early stages. We have to be very forgiving and very compassionate with ourselves and realize that we're making great progress, and greater progress will be done. And as this healing and recovery takes place, that is the main death knell for the Black Lodge, for the sorcerers. Nothing else. You can run around with your political placards as much as you like. They're not even worried about that. In their own symbolism, we looked at some of it. The very fact that they use the checkered floor, the black and white squares of the checkerboard, the chessboard, is emphasizing the conflict between ignorance and knowledge. That's what the war is all about. Their own symbolism tells you that. The Bible tells you that. The sacred Gospels tell you that. The Gospel of Philip, it says, ignorance is the mother of all evil. In Proverbs, the wise will inherit honor, that the fools get disgrace. Didn't Socrates say that the greatest good is knowledge, the greatest evil ignorance? The Indian words for it are dharma and karma. Dharma meaning the reason you're here. Not the reason your mother wanted you to be born and daddy thinks you're going to carry on his name and the uncle wants you to follow in his business and everything and all this nonsense. Or they're going to hand you over to the monks and the priests to do as they say. Dharma is your reason for being here. Karma is ignorance. That's all the word means. And you're not in dharma when you're in karma. When you are not plugged into your selfhood, then you have the karma. When you have your selfhood, karma stops. It's not sins accumulating through time like the priests have lied to you about. That doesn't make any sense if you logically think it over. It makes a lot of sense to them because they can control your ass. But the point is that karma is your ignorance, your unawareness of the true meaning of life. The moment that you are aware of the purpose that you're here, there is no karma. You step out of karma. That's the way out. In modern parlance and philosophical parlance is simply authentic and inauthentic existence. Now, in many interviews and other works we talked about this, the guilt complex, and how this plugs into all of this. Each one of us has a primal guilt, an unconscious guilt. Not the guilt of doing misdemeanors, and faux pas in this life. That's different. We have a subconscious guilt. Where does it come from? It comes from the commitment to the inauthentic life. It's tied in with karma, but the idea is that the guilt, you have a primal guilt. Psychologists know all about it. But it comes, how do you get it? It comes because you make an unconscious decision to live inauthentically. With that comes a certain guilt. And that guilt then, it's almost like, say, the inauthentic life is the soil. From that grows the tree, the hideous inverted tree of the guilt complex, and from that come all the other negative branches, all the filthy offspring of this one demon. Because now that you've committed to the inauthentic life, now you're going to deny it. Now you're going to justify it, right? Now you're going to decorate it. Now you're going to be in denial and denial of the denial. Now you're going to want this inauthentic existence to be better, brighter, safer, and more secure. Now you're going to say, I want to cluster with other inauthentic souls to make me feel that I've done the right thing. Hence the collectivism that comes about. You see, and there's many more we could mention. Then you have the ubiquitous extroversion, just running around infatuated with all of the domestic and social minutiae. The infatuation with nonsense in the world, and the chronic dependency on others, and then the fact that you don't get the cues and affectations back, which makes you a neurotic individual. Now that you're dependent, then you don't get what you want, you become now completely neurotic. One level of derangement, you see, leading to another. One hideous inverted tree of life, as I've described it. The way out of it, of course, is to return to the dharmic life. And that's what we're going to examine, how to do that. Or I said one of the other negative aspects that comes of this, one of the offspring, is just the ubiquitous competitiveness. Now you have to be better than the other inauthentic soul, where you don't have true stance, you don't have true status, you don't have true sovereignty. So now you run around performing, using your body like some sort of crazy thing to outperform others. It's nothing more than hierarchy. You're building your own hierarchies. And from the top of your pyramid, you're shouting the other pyramid down. Down with the Illuminati while you stand on the top of your own pyramid. Wonderful. They're doing that, aren't they? They can't rise of their own nature. They're the lowest psychopathic people. But you can rise in another way. Suppress everybody else. Artificially suppress everyone else, and that's how you get a feeling of the high. The spiritual man, the true magus, he rises of his own accord. It's not relevant to what anybody else does. The collectivism, right across the street. Posters saying, we are you. Right? I am who I am because of everyone. And people think nothing of this. This makes them fuzzy and warm all over. Because the identity is being sold in the marketplace. Talking again about the unconscious mind and its nature. Freud said nothing can be brought to an end in the unconscious. Nothing is past or forgotten. Right? The sorcerers know this, which is why they use symbolism. Like the Scots historian Carlyle was talking about. They're using that as a weapon against you because they know in here there is no time. In the unconscious, wow, it's a quantum universe in which all... Carl Gustav Jung puts it this way: when an inner situation is not made conscious, it appears outside of you as fate. So that which you repress, that's what you divide, that which you try to cut off. Nature has a higher plan. Remember we talked about the tragedy that visits you? Yeah, that's the plan. The plan is that the unconscious is made of the same thing nature is. So fate will work against your inauthenticity. Thank God it does. I wish it didn't come in the form of pain and tragedy and sorrow, but it does. Therefore we have to then enter into a new relationship with those dark guardians. Or continue resisting it, which continues the repression, which continues the fate. An endless circle, you see, of problems. And it's really never more true than today, you see. Now we look at man and his world. How his mind does create his reality. Well, Plato said it. States are as men, they grow out of human characters. The great Thomas Paine. To understand the nature and quantity of government proper for man, it is necessary to attend to his character. He goes on to say, the more perfect civilization is, the less occasion it has for government. Because you're self-governed. What do you need leaders for? Benjamin Franklin said it in this way. He said, only a virtuous people are capable of freedom. As nations become corrupt and vicious, they have more need of masters. All pointing to the fact that what's in your inner constitution, your inner republic, will manifest externally. Erich Fromm, whose book we looked at earlier, and I want you to note these scholars, note these authors, these sources that we're referring to, he says that in addition to sadism, the passion to destroy life and the attraction to all that is dead, which is called necrophilia, is true meaning of the word, seem to develop in the new urban civilization. Right? Mind affects the world, world affects mind. It becomes a feedback loop. What is above is below, is the old Hermetic adage. He says that death is no longer symbolically expressed by unpleasant smelling feces or corpses. Its symbols are now clean, shining machines. But the reality behind this antiseptic facade becomes increasingly visible. Man, in the name of progress, is transforming the world into a stinking and poisonous place. He pollutes the air, the water, the soil, the animals, and himself. He is doing this to a degree that has made it doubtful whether the earth will still be livable within 100 years from now. As your psyche becomes more toxic, so does your outer world. It'll become axiomatic to us. Freud understood this deeply. Again, the psychologists have to pick up the pieces of all of these souls. So for Freud, the historical process is essentially tragic. The more man creates cultures, the more does he frustrate his instinctual drives. The more unhappy and neurotic does he become. We talked about the trauma. In my work, I've always suggested that out of that trauma was born the ego. What we know today to be waking ego consciousness is the product, a recent product, an infantile, childlike troubleshooting and problem-making, problem-creating circuitry within our consciousness. Of course, the ego is particularly oriented, like a lighthouse light, to the external world. It's not really oriented towards the inner world at all. And we have to thank the ego for also saving us. Probably we would have a complete psychosis given what happened in ancient times. William Barrett, in his book Irrational Man, which is a book on existential philosophy, he says, so long as we remain in the womb of this externalized and public existence, we are spared the terror and the dignity of becoming a self. So again, we've lost ourselves in the light. We're actually hiding, not in the darkness, but in the light. Hiding amongst all the other existentially vagrant souls, screaming about allness and oneness and all of this other talismanic terminology, because it's the last thing we have inside. Won't spend much time on it, but my work, my analysis of all of this, I also say that with the ego, or you can think of it as an aspect of the ego if you will, came this thing I refer to as the mysterium. That the ego is really a two-headed monster. And that this mysterium has worked in the dark. It's one of the reasons why there are the barriers See, everybody talks about these various levels of consciousness, or the ego and the pre-conscious and the subconscious. They forget about the barriers in the middle. That must be made of something. Where did they come from? I'm interested in finding out where the glue and cement came to create the barriers. What's that made out of? I mean, it's like, you take the meat away and you throw away the other part. Yeah, but wait a minute. Where did that sinew come from? Who made those walls and those fences? Some would say, as they do, it's the ego, another part of the ego, or it's the superego. Wow. I looked into it and I refer to this archetypal or ersatz, or pseudo-archetypal presence as the mysterium. But anyway, moving on, commenting more on the pseudo-self, or the ego, as we say, Jung says, inasmuch as the ego is only the centrum or center of my field of consciousness, it is not identical with the totality of my psyche, being merely a complex among other complexes. Since I discriminate between the ego and the self, since the ego is only the subject of my consciousness, while the self is the subject of my totality, hence it also includes the unconscious psyche. In this sense, the self would be an ideal factor which embraces and includes the ego. So he's just trying to define more clearly what the self is. The ego, right, is only an ego because it's the social persona that divides itself off from the rest of consciousness, the vast majority. The self is the totality, including the ego and the unconscious. And so one could argue, as I do, that when psychologists talk about madness, dementia, psychosis, schizophrenia being the result of the waves and the waters of the dark unconscious, the id coming in to upset, right, the normality of the ego, what happens if they're wrong? What happens if the content of the unconscious doesn't seek to overwhelm and destroy the ego, but to embrace it? But that embrace has been mistranslated. We each fear that embrace. You know why? Because the ego wants to do the embracing. To use religious terminology, maybe the reason why you can't embrace God or embrace the goddess is because you need to be able to be embraced by that force. And as you strive to gain it, have it, want it, that force is pushed away. It's a very yin thing, being loved by the force. You can love it, but it's when it loves you that's the main thing. And how do you become receptacle to that? How do you become feminine enough to receive that wisdom? Well, the ego is incapable of that. It's not programmed for it, so don't expect it to happen. There's only one thing the ego is programmed out of, and that's trauma. So it'll act like a traumatized creature. Now, there's a quote. Carl Jung said, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to stop from facing their souls, to stop from doing their shadow work." So when a psychologist tries to get in there, all sorts of resistances and defenses come out. He's talking about soul. Religious people talk about it. It's no different than the self. Self and soul are identical words. And here's the classic quote right here. Thomas Saz, "People often say that this or that person has not found himself, but the self is not something one finds. It is something one creates. Once you understand that, you have basically unplugged all the lie mechanisms that exist around you. That is the first step on the road to true self-discovery, true enlightenment." I've often pointed out that the soul, the self, is the soul. It is also specifically identical with what the religious people, the Christians, speak of as the Holy Spirit. And I elaborated on this in the article, 2012, Shiva and the Age of Aquarius and all of that. That's gone into in great depth. Well, you don't want to do it, which most people don't want to do, any of that. They'd rather run around. Okay, well, Ayn Rand reminds you of the consequences for that. Man, as she says, is free to choose not to be conscious. But he's not free to escape the penalty of unconsciousness, destruction. What do we see in the world? That level of denial. The magician Aleister Crowley put it in probably the most succinct language that you could imagine. He said that anyone who is forced from his own course, either through not understanding himself or through external imposition, comes into conflict with the order of the universe and suffers accordingly. Now, this is a man who's been accused of everything you can imagine. Every epithet of horror has been applied to him. No less, he was called a black magician. He says in his own words, I have been accused of being a black magician. No more foolish statement, he says, has ever been made about me. I despise the thing to such an extent that I can hardly believe in the existence of people so debased and as idiotic as to practice it, meaning evil magic or black magic. But he's talking here about the useful or necessary suffering that is visited upon you because you are out of accord with the universe, her, it, nature, which is ultimately the self. Live external to it, expect pain. Live external, live in discord to the world's laws, expect pain. But what kind of pain do you want? The pain of the ever-loving mother or the pain of the... Vernon Howard, the American teacher and philosopher, said that human sickness is so severe that few can bear to look at it. But those who do will become well. That's right. The first stage of the awakening process is that to realize you can't live in a one-season world. To do so, to ignore those seasons of the psyche is as mad and as insane as to try to avoid nature's cycles and rhythms, not only of the week, but of the month and of the season. I put it in another way in the 2012 talk. I said, you can voice it this way. You can say, have I been sold a lie? That's one level of where people often can come to, right, when they sort of question that. Or the more adept and ultimately the more wise person phrases the question this way: have I bought a lie? See, one is disempowered, the other is empowered. Because somebody can sell you something doesn't mean you've got to buy it. Now Pythagoras, because this story's been known long, long time ago. It's not just something of the modern age, you know. Back in the 6th century BC, Pythagoras put it this way: thou shalt know, self-chosen are the woes that fall on men. How wretched, for they see not good so near, nor hearken to its voice. Few only know the pathway of deliverance from ill. So in my work, I'm not that interested or concerned, you see, with all of these different, the social reform where one tyrant replaces another tyrant. We've had that. I think we should be all waking up to that, how unsustainable that is. I'm looking at this reform within, the psychological reform, of how unbelievably violent we are to ourselves. We get distracted with the external violence, and that'll be handled, and it needs to be looked at. But we are infinitely violent with ourselves, infinitely masochistic and self-sadistic. And it's that kind of creature that then breeds it all throughout the world in its other forms and permutations. Sophocles put the entire problem this way. He's a great Greek playwright and deep thinker, and he said that, look, nothing vast enters the life of mortals without a curse. Talking about that suffering again. Somehow, as our tragedy, our pain, our sorrow leads us back to the shrine. I wish it wasn't that way, but it is. Therefore, the only thing to do then is to come into a different relationship with that force of tragedy. And I hope you can explore a little bit about that today. Now, Jung says this: the foundation of all mental illness is the unwillingness to experience legitimate suffering. That kind of sounds weird until you realize that there's a whole tradition of it through the mythologies and the great peoples of the world. Based their entire pantheons and seek and search for enlightenment on that very statement. For instance, Gerald Massey reminds us, the Egyptians had no vicarious atonement, no imputed righteousness, no second-hand salvation. No initiate in the Osirian mysteries could possibly have rested his hope on reaching heaven on the Galilean line of glory. His was the more crucial way of Amenta. Amenta meaning the underworld. To tread with the guidance of the word, that step by step and act by act, he must himself make true. So what we're talking about was literally the bedrock of all of the theologies of the ancient world before it got corrupted. This process of Amenta, this process of stepping yourself step by step to your own Dharma, has been referred to in psychological language by Jung as individuation, the separation, the differentiation of yourself from every other person around you and the world in general. The opposite, habituation, which everybody knows. Conformity, escape into the domestic minutiae. In alchemy and in magic, this individuation is nothing more than the chemical wedding. But as I said in 2012 talk, that all sounds rosy until you realize that before you can have the chemical wedding, you must experience the chemical divorce. The divorce from everything that is not true. All the fakery, all the lies, all the deceit, right? The external and internal adversaries. You arrive at the wedding, right, after you've gone through the detox process. Ayn Rand, who wasn't necessarily a psychologist, but basically said the same thing in different ways. She says that civilization is the process of setting man free from men. In other words, individuation. Anti-collectivism. There's two words I'd like to introduce to you, and I hope you know. Wilhelm Windelbrand, a psychologist, sociologist, came up with two incredible words. He said ideographic. And these words pertain to what we're talking about. Ideographic, meaningful events or experiences which cannot be replicated or understood with general absolute rules or codes, or the nomothetic ones, experiences which are replicable and scientifically verifiable. The Taoists and Zen say you can't step on the same piece of water twice. That's ideographic. As I said, your memories of your schoolyard, right? Your memories of whatever it might be, the pencil you wrote with at school, you know, your first friends playing with marbles in the street or whatever, it's your memory. It's absolutely ideographic, but we are conditioned out of that. Well, everybody does that. Revisit all the things you've done in your life and realize those are unique to one person, yourself. Nomothetic, well, that's everybody, and can be reproduced mechanically. Alan Watts puts it this way: the most strongly enforced of all known taboos is the taboo against knowing who or what you really are behind the mask of your apparently separate, independent, and isolated ego. In other words, you have the pseudo-self, the ego. But behind that, well, there's a void. The great psychologist Arno Gruen said it this way: a distorted development of autonomy is the root cause of the pathological and ultimately evil element in human beings. Erich Fromm says that self-awareness, reason, and imagination have disrupted the harmony that characterizes animal existence. Their emergence has made man into an anomaly, a freak of the universe. He's part of nature, subject to her physical laws, and unable to change them. Yet he transcends nature. He is set apart while being a part. He is homeless, yet chained to the home he shares with all creatures. The Bible, right? Jesus' words, man, the Son of Man, hath no place to rest his head. We are set apart, we're different. That means we've got a duty. That's why it's very important. We're set apart because we have a dharma to perform. And the parasites, right, the infected ones, the agents of the sleep, the agents of Newtonian sleep, that want to keep us in this unconscious, inauthentic, ignorant, ultimately ignorant mode. It's basically a conflict between them. But they represent a part of our own selves that wants to also remain in that state. They're just external manifestations of it. Cast into this world, says Fromm, at an accidental place and time, he's forced out of it accidentally and against his will. Being aware of himself, he realizes his powerlessness and the limitations of his existence. He's never free from the dichotomy of his existence. He cannot rid himself of his mind, even if he would want to. He cannot rid himself of his body as long as he is alive, and his body makes him want to be alive. So he's looking at both the positive and negative aspects of being conscious. The great R.D. Laing says it this way: true sanity entails in one way or another the dissolution of the normal ego, the false self competently adjusted to our alienated social reality, the emergence of the inner archetypal mediators of divine power, and through the death and rebirth and eventual re-establishment of a new kind of ego functioning, the ego, now being the servant of the divine, is no longer its betrayer. So he's saying again what we talked about: chemical wedding, chemical divorce. You have to deconstruct one sense of self before the other arises in its place. Jung says it this way: only when all crutches and props are broken and no cover from the rear offers even the slightest hope of security does it become possible for us to experience an archetype that up until then has lain hidden. The archetype of meaning. Remember D.H. Lawrence's quote about being sponged out, erased? Remember the alchemical idea about being reduced down to the basic elements? And previously we even analyzed the alternative meaning of the word enlightenment. The lightness, right, in weight that comes when you do this process. When you are no longer emotionally affected, either negatively or positively, by what another person thinks, says, and does. Now, that's not just a statement. I mean, try it. I mean, go and do it. Or find out how impossible it is. Experiment with yourself. How much time and energy does your mind spend? Don't judge yourself, just observe it. How much do other people matter to you? How much thought goes into what X, Y, and Z are doing? Don't judge yourself, don't critique yourself, don't become self-sadistic over it, just observe it. How much other people matter to us psychologically, and then realize that everyone is doing that. There's a crime going on around the world, you know, and it starts right here. Just observe it and let it draw from it whatever conclusion you want. Some people may think, I want to be like that. That's what it's all about. That's life. That's caring. That's giving. That's self-sacrifice, whatever. I'm just making the statement. Or, more deeply, observe yourself and how your idea of yourself, because I won't condescend to call it your real self, because actually the person who's in true selfhood hasn't got the slightest disaffection by what another person says, thinks, or does towards him. None at all. The reason why you do is because you have an idea of yourself. And the first moment a person says a couple of syllables against that image of yourself, and you become as evil as the George Bushes and the rest of the world, all the tyrants. Their tyranny is just with a bigger gun than ours. You see this in the schoolyards. You see it. It's ubiquitous. It's reeking from the world, all of this tyranny. It's not just in the corridors of power. What a luxury to be saying, oh, only there it is. A great deal of this has to do with this intimate connection. It's one of the awarenesses that come on the road. As you climb higher up the mountain, right, you get a bigger vista and revelations that you couldn't have when you're stuck down in the valley. Well, one of them is actually that age-old known thing to shamanism, known thousands of years ago, that's now been hidden, which is the intimate connections between psychic and physical energy, or the microcosm and the macrocosm. Granted, it has been rediscovered by the quantum scientists. The book Holographic Universe is highly recommended for that purpose, for people who want to look back into the scientific aspects of that. Leonard Slane says that according to the new physics, observer and observed are somehow connected, and the inner domain of subjective thought turns out to be intimately conjoined to the external sphere of objective facts. Well, Richard Milton says that Rupert Sheldrake has sought answers to the unexplained mysteries thrown up by research that are usually ignored by science. When a laboratory rat has learned a new trick in one place, other rats elsewhere seem to be able to learn it more easily. When some birds first learned to open milk bottles on the doorstep, birds all over the country suddenly learned the same trick. Sheldrake's solution to these puzzles, proposed in his 1983 book, A New Science of Life, is that organisms and species can learn, develop, and adapt through a process he calls morphic resonance. It's very akin to the implicate order of David Bohm. In the book The Cosmic Serpent by Jerry Narbury, he says that in the early 1980s, thanks to the development of a sophisticated measurement device, a team of scientists demonstrated that the cells of all living beings emit photons at a rate of up to approximately 100 units per second and per square centimeter of surface area. They also showed that the DNA was the source of the photon emission. Photons is the highest form of light that we presently know. Deepak Chopra addresses the whole concept of photonic action and how that's a bridge between the external and internal world, you see. He said photons come out of nowhere. They cannot be stored. They can barely be pinned down in time. They have no home in space whatsoever. See, so they transcend space. They're exactly the same as the unconscious thought processes of our minds work. That is, light occupies no volume and has no mass. The similarity between a thought and a photon is very deep. Both are born in the region beyond space and time, where nature controls all processes in that void, which is full of creative intelligence. Richard Allen Miller and Iona Miller, in their Nexus article, says there is a harmonic relationship between the Earth and our mind-body. Earth's low-frequency isoelectric field, the magnetic field of the Earth, and the electrostatic field that emerges from our bodies are closely interwoven. Our internal rhythms interact with external rhythms, affecting our balance, our REM patterns and mental focus. So the science is now coming back to what the mystics of old have been saying for years. Now I would ask a question then. Are the mental, emotional and psychological states of human beings causing the changes in the electromagnetism of the planet? All the dysfunction that we see. And that's drawing very much on the teachings of Wilhelm Reich, who turned all of that upside down and said consciousness is affecting what you imagine as weather patterns you see and social changes and all of that dynamic. And that needs to be taken on board too. As I say, we're not making any point, it's to be studied. Because this could take us into all sorts of areas. Alan Watts says that lack of knowledge about the evolution of the organic from the inorganic, coupled with misleading myths about life coming into this world from somewhere outside, has made it difficult for us to see that the biosphere arises, or goes with, a certain degree of geological and astronomical evolution. As Douglas E. Harding has pointed out, we tend to think of this planet as a life-infested rock, which is as absurd as thinking the body is a cell-infested skeleton. But that's what everybody thinks, isn't it? That's what religion teaches. You just came from out there into this. Not that you grew out of it, as a tree grows out of it. That happens to be you out there every time you look at nature. What happens if you thought that? What happens if you realized that's you? That's an extension of your selfhood, right there, nature. Nature and you are one. You didn't come out from some mysterious outside of it, into it. You grew from within it, as part of it. It is you and you are it in the same way that a single drop of water on a leaf reflects the entire topography all around it. What would that do to our thinking if we really caught it, really got in touch with it? That every brother and sister, every tree that you see is part of yourself, by the way. Alan Watts addresses this connection between self and nature. Surely all forms of life, he says, including man, must be understood as symptoms of the earth, the solar system and the galaxy, in which case we cannot escape the conclusion that the galaxy is intelligent. Maybe not the kind of consciousness we have, but it's intelligent nevertheless. Somebody put it there, and it certainly isn't plugged in, although science is desperately seeking to find the plug so we can find out its power, right? He says that the first result of this illusion is that our attitude to the world outside us is largely hostile. We are forever conquering nature, space, mountains, deserts, bacteria and insects, instead of learning to cooperate with them in a harmonious order. In America, the great symbols of this conquest are the bulldozer and the rocket, the instrument that batters the hills into flat tracks for little boxes made of ticky-tacky, and the great phallic projectile that blasts up into the sky. Well, Mikhail Bakunin, the head of anarchism, put it this way. In his book, God and the State, he says that the liberty of man consists solely in this, that he obeys the laws of nature because he himself recognized them as such, and not because they've been imposed upon him externally by any foreign will whatsoever, human or divine, collective or individual. The champions of selfhood will always put it that way. The great artists know how to tell us subtextually, this story. For instance, this famous image here of Adam, the creation of Adam in the Sistine Chapel. Adam is outside the realm of the God. But more so, the creative God is actually sitting inside a brain. Do you see how the cloak that surrounds God there on the right is actually shaped to look like a cross-section of the human brain? God is within, is what Michelangelo is saying. And in a way, that creative force within us, which gave rise to all of this, Adam, as we know ourselves to be, right? He is in fact cut off from that. He is divorced from that. He's separate. He's on the outside until he awakens to the higher truth, which of course you can better believe that the Pope who funded Michelangelo to paint this had no idea what Michelangelo was subtextually saying and referring to. It's actually the most anti-religious statement you could imagine. God is within your brain, you are God. That's not what they wanted to hear. Tony Bushby says that the Church Fathers knew all about this. According to Bishop Epiphanius, the Christ is the spiritual self within each person. Clement of Alexandria, right? great church patriarch, he says the greatest of all lessons is to know yourself. For when a man knows himself, he knows God. So at one point, even this self-knowledge was featured in religion in a very strong way. In Hebrews we read, without father, without mother, without human descent. His life has neither beginning nor end, but as the Son of God, he abides as a holy priest continually. So the one under God is without any of these connections to other human beings. He stands alone. In the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus says, many stand outside the door, but it is only the solitaries who will enter into the bridal chamber. Talking about the chemical wedding that comes after the divorce from all the other falsity of the world. In 1 John we read, you have been anointed by the Holy One and have knowledge of all things. The anointing which you received from him abides in you, and you have no need that anyone should teach you, as his chrism teaches you about everything, and is true and is no lie, just as it has taught you, abide in him, the higher self. And once you have that, you need no other authority. As I said, this was in the ancient legends of the earliest peoples on the earth. In the very Song of Odin, it says, I know that I hung on the windy tree for 9 whole nights. Right? 9 is the cycle of initiation, see? Wounded with a spear, dedicated to Odin, myself to myself. Nobody stuck him there, nobody nailed him on there. To go and seek the mystery of the runes was a willing participation in suffering, a willing entering into a menta, right? He hung upside down. And the windy or the winding tree is the Kabbalistic tree on which the secrets of the runes exist, which is nothing more than the self. But the key there is that this was an oblation not to God or not to some guru, but to oneself, not to a cause, not an ideal. Crazy Horse, the shaman of the Lakota people, says that I salute the light within your eyes where the whole universe dwells. For when you are at the center within yourself. Hang on a minute. There's a lot of talk about oneness today. But theirs is the oneness of a million broken shards. Unawakened, inauthentic, lost, dependent, codependent, ignorant, broken selves coming together and thinking we're all one. What kind of oneness is that? A paper mache Quatermass monster? Allness is that if there has to be a confederation, then let it be of whole men. There's nothing broken about a crazy horse. Those people are not a tribe, they're a tribe within a tribe, right? They are whole people. That is the meaning of wholeness, not this talismanic, globalistic rubbish that you're hearing today. Come on to me, all ye who are broken and deranged, into our little program. Barrett goes on to say that this seriousness, is the simple and forthright seriousness of someone who has at last arrived at the center, who is therefore at last totally engaged in the project of his life, with all that it entails. This person exists under the eye of eternity, and therefore what he does in the moment is absolutely real. It's nothing more than Heidegger had been saying. Das Ein, being there, being here, you being here. It doesn't matter what everybody else is doing. So don't you see then that this is obvious now what the real holy work is? The holy work is to find out, is it not, what stops you from doing that? Every single thing that prevents you from that level of awareness, from being engaged in the project of your life, must be scrutinized, must be critiqued and understood. You have to understand the anatomy. Forget about finding out what selfhood is. Find out what holds you back from that process. Everything. That's the job. It's not easy. As Friedrich Nietzsche said, the individual has always had to struggle to keep from being overwhelmed by the tribe. If you try it, you will often be lonely and sometimes frightened. But no price is too high to pay for the privilege of owning yourself. If you don't own yourself, right? If you don't move from those white squares of knowledge, if you don't move on to the white squares of knowledge, somebody else will. That's the dynamic. It's nothing more complicated than that. If you don't own yourself, somebody else will patent you. They're telling you they're doing it, by the way. They're telling you that's the gig. It makes sense, doesn't it, of all this transhumanism we see. They're owning you. The Russell Trust owns you, the Queen of England, the Pope. If you're not selling yourself elsewhere, they'll own you anyway. They got rights. Fromm speaks about biophilia, the love of the body, the love of the organic, the love of nature. Biophilia is the passionate love for life and of all that is alive. It is the wish to further growth, whether in a person, a plant, an idea, or a social group. The biophilious person wants to be more rather than to have more. It's connected to what Aristotle talked about, entelechy, the development inherent in every single thing to become something, right? A daffodil doesn't become a potato plant. An oak doesn't become, a myrtle. Everything has the seed of its own identity within it. Everything, even every snowflake is an individual. Now, in one of the earliest scripts, going back thousands upon thousands of years, the Vedas, well, from the Srimad Bhagavatam, this is addressed. Aryans do not kill even a small plant unnecessarily, not to speak of cutting trees for sense gratification. Aryans do not distinguish between lower and higher grades of life. All life should be protected. All living beings have the right to live, even the trees and the plants. This is the basic principle of an Aryan civilization. Compare that to the monstrosities that we are doing today. Mark Twain said, "Once you discover that the whole world is mad, all the mysteries of life stand explained." Well, mad, contradictory. Since the United Nations was founded in 1945, there have been 140 wars. As Nietzsche said, in individuals' insanity, it's rare. But in parties, groups, and epochs, it is the rule.